Welcome to Strategy Speaks, the official podcast of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I am your host, Daniel Fiott, and for this 17th episode of Strategy Speaks, I am pleased to welcome Alexander Mattelaer and Elie Perot to the podcast for a discussion about the recent French-UK agreement on nuclear cooperation, also known as the Northwood Declaration. Professor Dr. Alexander Mattelaer is an associate professor at the VUB and senior academic at CSDS, and Dr. Elie Perot is an assistant professor at the VUB and also a researcher at CSDS. Welcome to you both, Alexander and Elie. Elie, if we can start with you first. On the 10th of July 2025, France and the UK issued the so-called Northwood Declaration on nuclear policy and cooperation. The declaration states that our nuclear forces are independent and can be coordinated and contribute significantly to the overall security of the alliance. That's quoting from the declaration itself. For the benefit of our listeners, how significant do you think this announcement is?
Thank you, Daniel, for having me on the podcast. And so to answer your question, I think it's significant on different levels, right? For the UK, for France individually, for the UK-French cooperation in nuclear, and then for Europeans more broadly. So I think if I start with the UK, perhaps, I think here actually the fact that there is this language, right, that, I mean, its nuclear deterrent remains independent, like France, but it's coordinated, is perhaps a bit less surprising for the UK, because the UK is already cooperating with the US in terms of industry for its nuclear deterrent, right? It cooperates on the Trident, its nuclear missiles, on the warheads. The UK is already part of the nuclear planning group in NATO, so it's already coordinating its nuclear deterrent within the context of the alliance. Also, there's been this recent announcement by the UK that it will join nuclear sharing, right, with by buying F-35A, dual capable aircraft. So I think here for the UK, it's a bit, I mean, the fact that there is this cooperation is a bit less new. In a conceptual sense, what's new is this European dimension and the deepening of cooperation with France in particular. For France, I think here on a conceptual level, it's much more, the doctrinal change is much more important, because France has put much more emphasis on its autonomy, on the independence of its nuclear deterrence. So saying, well, it remains independent, but it's coordinated with another country, I think that's quite a significant change in terms of language, in terms of concept. I think then for the UK-French relation also, it's the Northwood Declaration is important. Also, another bit of the declaration is important. I mean, there's the one you mentioned, but also the one that builds up basically on the Chequers Declaration of 1995. The Chequers Declarations was, stated that the France and the UK do not see a situation arising in which the vital interests of one would be threatened without the vital interests of the other being threatened as well. And here, the important bit that's the Northwood Declaration adds to that is that the UK and France do not see or do not consider that there is, they say that there is no extreme threat to Europe that would not prompt a response by or two nations. So I think there's been this broadening of the Chequers Declaration to the rest of Europe. It's still a bit ambiguous, of course, in terms of the response. Could be conventional, could be nuclear. I mean, the use of extreme threat and the adjective extreme in particular, I think that evokes a bit the nuclear dimension, because nuclear weapons would be used in extreme situations of self-defense. There's no automaticity also, of course, there, but there's this European dimension. I think there are other things that are quite important here in the Northwood Declaration, in the Lancaster also 2.0 communique or declaration that combined the Northwood Declaration, in particular this setting up of a nuclear steering group, right, that would be directed at the highest political level, both in France and the UK, where there will be discussions. I mean, so far under the Lancaster House Treaty, there were cooperation. There was cooperation mostly on nuclear safety, nuclear research, And now there is this possibility that there will be cooperation on policy, on capabilities, on operations. So potentially, perhaps a bit more coordination in terms of the patrol of the French and UK submarines, perhaps even distribution of targets. Nuclear targeting as well. And then I think the last dimension is for Europeans, and here it's a bit less clear, exactly what that means. The French and the Brits, they were very careful in, putting their announcement within this context, the broader context of European and Euro-Atlantic security, saying our cooperation contributes to European and Euro-Atlantic security. But here, of course, it's a bilateral announcement, but that's unilateral vis-a-vis the rest of Europe, right? It's France and UK saying, or nuclear deterrent contributes or can protect you. So here we'll see how it goes. On the French side, for instance, on the 13th of July, President Macron made a speech in front of the French armed forces, saying, that he had mandated the French Minister of Defense, the French Chief of Staff, to start a strategic dialogue with interested European partners on that European dimension of the French nuclear deterrent. He said also there would be a speech by him at the end of the year where it would come back in greater details on what that entails or the changes that may come for the French nuclear deterrent. But I think all that remains very much to be seen at that stage.
Thanks so much, Elie, for giving us your overview of the Northwood Declaration plus everything else. I agree with you. It's quite interesting to see the Entente cordiale going in different directions, and I specifically appreciated how you teased out the nuances in the UK position and the French position, and also highlighting as well, I think, the fact that such a joint declaration and level of ambition comes because of the very, let's say, dangerous security situation in Europe, which both countries have explicitly stated publicly in their strategic documents as well. Alexander, based on what Elie has already mentioned, we've seen nuclear deterrence return to the Euro-Atlantic security agenda in, I would say, a very, very big way. So I guess my question to you would be, how do you assess the France-UK announcement and the declaration and level of cooperation? How do you assess that in terms of the wider alliance discussions about nuclear deterrence?
Thank you for that question, Daniel. And it's also on my side a pleasure to be back on Strategy Speaks. I have read the recent UK Strategic Defence Review and the French Revue Nationale Stratégique that was released only days ago with a great deal of interest. And unsurprisingly, both documents put considerably more emphasis on nuclear deterrence than the previous iterations of the same documents from a few years ago. And that, of course, reflects the post-2022 environment that we now find ourselves in which the Russian nuclear threat now looms so much more prominently than before. We also see extensive references, not just to Russia, but to the expansion of the Chinese nuclear arsenal. The French Revue Stratégique is very explicit in that regard. And in that sense, both documents kind of confirm what has already been signaled in the evolution of NATO-agreed language on these themes, but it is much more explicit because all the NATO documents, the strategic concept, the communique at Vilnius, the Washington Declaration, they represent negotiated text amongst the 32 allies, right? So everything gets a bit watered down. But now in the French and UK strategic documents, we get for the first time a proper, fully fledged assessment how the UK and France, as nuclear powers in their own right, look at the evolution of the nuclear threat environment in detail. And they do so from an awareness that this is actually a threat that potentially affects their homelands. And correspondingly, they take it very, very seriously. So I think that's a bit the background to all of this. Then zooming in on what has now been recently communicated by means of the Northwood Declaration, I think the main takeaways are really twofold in my mind. The first one, and arguably the most important one, is that London and Paris now say upfront that their strategic arsenals can conceivably be used in combination. That is to say, in case of a very large-scale Russian nuclear escalation on the European continent, Moscow must take into account the possibility of what one might call double Anglo-French vengeance, so to speak, which is very, very significant, even if the United States were to completely stay out of a nuclear conflict on the European continent. So I think the message to Moscow is unmistakable. Don't go there because it will be at the end of all for the countries concerned. Second, and this is more going into the details, the weeds of things, if you will, the Northwood Declaration represents the very first time that France accepts and indicates a willingness to coordinate with other allies beyond the policy level alone. And Elie has already talked about, well, that the declaration mentions capabilities and operations too. That is, especially for France, a major shift. Because that has hitherto no precedent. And it establishes, the Northwood Declaration establishes or signals the establishment of the UK-France Nuclear Steering Group, which will sort of exist alongside the Nuclear Planning Group that has existed since 1967-68 in the NATO framework, but of which, of course, France never was a member. So I think in the alliance context, it means that France is now open to synchronizing nuclear deterrence more with the rest of the allies than it was in the past. It also means that the United Kingdom actually comes to play and occupy a key coordination role in line with the ambitions expressed in the Strategic Defence Review, because the UK will be both coordinating with the US and with other allies in the MPG, as well as with France in the Nuclear Steering Group. And there is also, if we zoom out, more stuff happening in terms of the reinforcement of nuclear deterrence in general. And as Elie already mentioned, another key element thereof that is not in the Northwood Declaration but communicated separately is that the United Kingdom has announced it would be joining NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement. It will acquire what for the time being is a small number of 12 F-35As, dual capable aircraft, so that alongside the long-standing seaborne nuclear deterrent, the ballistic missile submarines with Trident missiles, the United Kingdom will in the future come to have a completely separate non-strategic nuclear strike option at its disposal, and the Royal Air Force is taking on a nuclear role again. It even sort of paves the way, I mean, for the time being, that this is with US weapons, but it is not inconceivable that over a longer time horizon, if circumstances would dictate that, there could be a next generation fighter platform carrying a sovereign UK warhead in an airborne mission just as well. I'll perhaps leave it at that, and can come back to other things later on.
Thanks so much, Alexander. I'm wondering if they shouldn't have renamed the Northwood Declaration the Double Anglo-French Vengeance, as you put it, which I found quite amusing. And also, thanks for taking us through, I think, the wider alliance landscape in terms of how nuclear deterrence is shaping up. And also, I think you raised a similarly important point to what Elie mentioned also, which is how this escalation could work even in policy terms and how that can be coordinated. I think that will be a very interesting question moving forward. And we've also now had a few references to the French National Strategic Defense Review, which is hot off the press. And here I come back to Elie as well, where we see in that review also the kind of accompanying announcement of more defense spending from France as well. And also quoting from the National Strategic Defense Review itself, where it says that the strategic capabilities of our armed forces, so the French armed forces, will be strengthened and nuclear deterrence modernized, right? So I guess in the context of our conversation, what I'd really like to ask you is, how do you understand that idea of nuclear deterrence modernization in a French context? And also, what do you think are the expected features of this modernization?
Well, actually, I don't think there's a lot that is new in the strategic review in that regard. I mean, in terms of the modernization of the French nuclear forces, because that's a process that's been engaged and launched now really a few years ago already. So what you see in the new strategic review is just a confirmation that the process is ongoing. Basically, the format is going to be the same, so we keep these two legs of the French nuclear deterrent, the airborne component and the seaborne component as well. And so it's just a confirmation, research and development is ongoing, even for some part we are in an early production phase of the new armaments that will make part of the French nuclear deterrent in the future. So basically, yes, the strategic reviews confirms that there will be that we keep these dyads for the reasons that existed before, that makes like the French nuclear deterrence more resilient, in particular to either an attack or also to technological changes. So I mean, so here the reasoning for the French do not change basically. For now, so we have the airborne component that's based on Rafale fighter jets, right, with nuclear cruise missiles, and the seaborne component that is based on some ballistic missile submarines that can launch intercontinental missiles with nuclear warheads. And well, on the side of submarines, so the modernization that is planned and that is just confirmed by the National Strategic Review is that there will be a third generation of nuclear submarine that should replace the current Le Triomphant class, right? That's the current system by 2035. And this new third generation of nuclear submarine should stay in service until well into the second half of the 21st century. So that's really a long-term program. The missile itself, the M51, well, should be modernized also by 2035. That would be a new variant, basically, not an entirely new missile. Also, that should come into service over the same time horizon. For the airborne component, the modernization that is planned is to replace the Rafale with the 6th generation fighter jet. So that's the famous European project, right? The future combat aircraft system that's being developed with Germany, Spain. I mean, for now, that's the plan. We know that there are a few difficulties there, and probably, Daniel, you know more about these kind of issues than I do. But the idea is that should be the new platform for the French nuclear deterrent, at least for its airborne component. And then in terms of missiles, so now we have the ASMPA, so the Air Sol Moyenne Portée Améliorée. So that means like a cruise missile with a middle range, middle range air ground capability, and it will be replaced by also by 2035 by what is called for now the ASN4G. So it's Air Sol Nucléaire de 4e génération. So it's an air ground nuclear missile of 4th generation. That will be also a cruise missile that will equip either the latest versions of the Rafale and then maybe the sixth generation aircraft. The key, I think, characteristic of this new cruise missile will be hypervelocity. I think where things might change, but it's still, again, a bit unclear, and maybe we have more clarity on that with the announcements of President Macron by the end of the year, is exactly the format in particular of the airborne component. Back in March, there was an announcement by the French president there would be a fourth nuclear-capable airbase that would be reopened at Luxeuil-les-Bains in the east of France. And there will be 2 other nuclear squadrons, basically, that would be created. So, but it's not yet clear to which extent that would affect the format or whether the entire format of the French airborne strategic forces will be reconfigured, whether we'll double basically the number of squadrons, because today there are 2. So do we add really 2 other ones? And does that mean also that we will double or at least increase the number of nuclear missiles that these airplanes can carry? I think now there's not really a lot of clarity in that regard. For now, the official doctrine and message is that the nuclear arsenal is not going to grow. There hasn't been a message like that, for instance, in the UK. I think there's been recently the message that the UK nuclear arsenal in its totality might increase in size. That's not yet the case for France. Perhaps that will come. I think also in that regard, actually, if you look at the strategic review, the strategic review remains very orthodox in terms of French doctrine. It really says that the French nuclear deterrent or French nukes are not for a war-fighting capability. In French nuclear doctrine, there is this refutation or rejection of this distinction between tactical and strategic weapons, right? So it's really not a battlefield weapon for France nuclear bombs. There's hardly a gradual doctrine of escalation. That hasn't changed in French doctrine. Basically, there's only one last nuclear warning that can be issued before full escalation. You see that confirmed for now in the strategic review. Whether that will change in the future or not, I don't know. I think the strategic review just says the things as they are today, right? But maybe there will be a few changes in that regard. I think one important thing I've noted in the strategic review, and I'm not entirely sure about the consequences of that language in the strategic review, is that it says that the offer to Europeans, right, to discuss nuclear deterrence together would not reduce or like what the changes that would be, this strategic dialogue will entail will not reduce the means necessary for the national nuclear deterrence. So I don't know if that means that Europeans should pay, basically, if they host French nuclear weapons, maybe like a bit like in the NATO nuclear sharing system, or does it mean does that open the door to expand the French nuclear arsenal, saying, we have that's now this size of the French nuclear arsenal because it's to protect or national interests in a narrow sense. And if we now think about it in a broader European sense, maybe we need to expand this arsenal. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure what that means for now, and I think we will find out this autumn most likely.
Yeah, thanks very much, Elie. Yeah, there's still a lot of wait and see going on around this overarching modernization process as well, and you also flagged, of course, the SCAF, the FCAS, to give it the other acronym, about where that will go as well, because it's intimately linked with this discussion about nuclear weapons as well. So I think that was a very, very good overview of where France stands on its modernization process, and I think we may have to in the future also record another podcast to come back to many of these questions that still remain unanswered, especially as we read more and more in depth into the National Strategic Defense Review as well. Also, Elie, I think you touched upon a really important point about defense modernization as well, which really goes now to the final question to Alexander. And I guess what many people are now observing is that NATO itself is under substantial pressure, right, to enhance its conventional defense forces. And it seems, everybody or every NATO ally is really pushing in this direction. So we have the conventional defense forces on one side, while at the same time, I guess with the French-UK nuclear cooperation initiative, it also seems that there are indications that the Europeans, or at least some Europeans, are willing to act alone if necessary, especially in the nuclear dimension. So I guess here we should bring in as well the discussion about the new 5% target of defense spending of GDP that was agreed at The Hague. So my question to you, I guess, is then, could you comment perhaps on how a greater awareness of nuclear deterrence could play out in defense budgeting and also planning assumptions within the alliance, given the tall task of developing conventional forces in lockstep as well?
Thank you for that question, Daniel. You know me too well. I always get excited and sometimes frustrated about defense budgeting discussions, because the emphasis really tends to go to the headline figures, and there is very few attempts taking place to sort of unpack things in granular detail throughout time. And I think that is really key to understanding the broader dynamics of defense budgeting. And it comes out really clearly if you sort of think through cost structures of conventional versus nuclear deterrence. So I think it's a great question. Elie already just walked us through the outline of French nuclear modernization. One could actually paint a very similar picture for the United Kingdom, which I will not do in the same detail, but by and large, it looks structurally similar. Only in time, it is sort of running a bit ahead of the timeline of the French. So now the Queen Elizabeth carriers are already close to being sort of fully in the system. Now the replacement of the Vanguard class ballistic missile submarines is sort of becoming the dominant dossier for the UK, with the new Dreadnought class being in construction and expecting to enter into service in the early 2030s, and then all the rest follows. So I think if we zoom out, it is critically important to bear in mind that nuclear modernization in and of itself, and potential expansion to the extent that the strategic environment warrants expansion, that is taking a very significant chunk out of the defense budgets of nuclear weapon states. And that typically goes a bit unseen from the point of view of the non-nuclear allies, because they just take it for granted that it is there in the background. But it is, from a budgeting perspective, very important, precisely because the long-term cost of the nuclear enterprise is extremely inelastic. It must always be in place in the background, and specifically for smaller defense budgets in relative terms, that is to say, compared to the US. So in the case of France and the United Kingdom, the long-term cost of the nuclear enterprise and production basis, it fluctuates from being a significant but overall still modest size of the defense budget to really becoming a sort of the lion's share of the defense budget during the peak of the modernization cycle. In the United States, in the case of the United States, precisely because the defense budget is so much larger, the cost of the modernization of nuclear systems can be sort of kept more in a smaller bandwidth compared to France and the UK. But now, given the size, the speed, and the scope of China's modernization an expansion of its nuclear arsenal, even in the case of the United States, it is becoming readily apparent that the so-called program of records in the United States is considered necessary but insufficient, and the United States has sort of been making up its mind that a very significant expansion of its arsenal is also required to take into account the combination of the nuclear threats coming from Russia and China together. And this is actually, if you zoom out, incredibly important because the nuclear deterrence component is the foundation of the deterrence posture of the alliance as a whole. And so for the US, for the United Kingdom, for France, this actually costs really a lot of money, significant shares of their defense budget, in particular for France and the UK. So I think by extension, that implies that the lion's share of the bill for reinforcing conventional deterrence in the alliance must be borne disproportionately by the non-nuclear allies, of which Germany is, of course, the largest in terms of purchasing power, but it actually goes for all the others who have, if you zoom out, who have the benefits of having more elasticity and flexibility in their defense budgeting system. And I think as the sort of the awareness of the importance of nuclear deterrence trickles into alliance structures, it becomes increasingly clear that that also offers additional intellectual justification for the burden sharing discussion in its new format, with the 5%, the 3.5 plus 1.5% of GDP having been agreed at The Hague. Now, having said all that, just to add in some more detail, I think it's also important to not overstate the distinction between the cost of nuclear deterrence versus conventional deterrence, precisely because there also exists considerable overlap in terms of the capability requirements for both missions. Here you can think, for example, of the investment that is now very prominent in the NATO defense planning process, the investment that is required for building up air and missile defenses in Europe, which on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, you have the whole Golden Dome initiative that is going to take up a very significant amount of resources, but it's really underpinning both conventional and nuclear deterrence. Apart from missile defenses, you can also think about the cost of tanker aircraft fleets, the dual capable aircraft themselves, of course, all the basing infrastructure that is required for the nuclear missions, both the shared nuclear mission in the NATO framework, as well as the operations, the infrastructure for nuclear operations of US, UK, and French strategic forces. You can also think of the cost of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems. In that category, you see the growth of investment in space-based assets that is taking out quite a bit of the budgetary envelope. In the EU framework, I would not be surprised to see, for instance, also quite a bit of EU common funding going into space. Space initiatives. So in that sense, yes, you can conceptually distinguish the long-term cost of conventional deterrence versus the long-term cost of conventional deterrence. The conventional deterrence is more elastic in terms of its cost over time. Nuclear deterrence is much more static, but at the same time, if you look at the defense enterprise as a whole, there is also a good chunk of capabilities that actually serves to support both missions simultaneously. And in that sense, you cannot fully disentangle this. And you also can sort of think through, how to approach trade-offs in terms of force availability across those two domains. And I think that's now a very important conversation taking place in the NATO planning community to sort of get the defense planners and the operations planners wrap their heads around in terms of how to prioritize capabilities for conventional and nuclear deterrence missions, how those two affect one another. And if you think through potential Article 5 campaigns, how the different parts fit together throughout time.
Thanks so much for that, Alexander, and for peeling back the layers of the onion there and the kind of intricacies involved in defense budgeting, both in conventional and nuclear terms. And I also appreciated your point, and I think Elie also mentioned this earlier about the crossover and a number of investments in technologies as well between conventional and nuclear. So, and also the way that you connected it back as well about the planning assumptions that will inevitably have to take place within a NATO context as well, to ensure that kind of NATO can adapt and also keep up with some of these rather bold and ambitious bilateral initiatives taking place. Thanks to you, Alexander and Elie, for, I think, a great conversation. Obviously, when it comes to this discussion, there's still a lot of wait and see to see how it develops, to see how the strategic context may even change as well in the coming months. So we most definitely will have you back on Strategy Speaks for another discussion about how the nuclear dimension is also evolving, and also to see how this kind of Entente Nucléaire, Entente Cordiale, however you want to call it, is also shaping up in the months and years ahead. So thank you so much for joining us for the 17th episode of Strategy Speaks, and you're very much welcome to join us for the next episode too.